It was a crisp spring afternoon in downtown Los Angeles, the kind of day where sunlight danced off the skyscrapers, and the city pulsed with its familiar rhythm. The streets were alive with honking horns, hurried footsteps, and fragmented conversations. Inside Midtown Financial Bank, the atmosphere was starkly different, sterile and uninviting, with an air of tension that seemed to seep from the marble floors. Eric Coleman, the bank manager, sat perched at his desk like a king on a throne, sharp-suited and perpetually smug. He wore his authority like armor. His icy demeanor and no-nonsense attitude were infamous among both staff and customers. Most people avoided eye contact, fearing his sharp tongue and cutting remarks. But that day, someone entered who wasn't like most people. The man stepped through the bank's glass doors without fanfare. He wore an old leather jacket, its creases telling stories of years gone by, and a pair of scuffed boots that had clearly walked more miles than most cared to imagine. His face, rugged and lined with experience, bore the weight of decades, but his eyes held a calm steadiness. He moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who didn't need to prove himself. Yet, to most in the room, he was just another figure blending into the backdrop of a busy day, just another nobody. To Eric Coleman, he was a nuisance. Coleman glanced up from his desk, his sharp eyes narrowing as he sized up the newcomer. "Do you have an appointment?" he asked, his voice curt, cutting through the hum of the bank. The man shook his head, his lips curving into a polite, almost imperceptible smile. "No, I don't need an appointment," he replied, his voice gravelly and steady, like the slow rumble of distant thunder. Coleman raised an eyebrow, his irritation thinly veiled. "Well, this isn't a walk-in service, and we're not a charity. If you don't have an account here, I suggest you move along." His words dripped with disdain, loud enough for the nearby customers to hear. The man didn't flinch. He simply held Coleman's gaze, his expression unreadable but calm. "Sometimes, it's not about accounts," he said quietly. "It's about how you treat people." Coleman let out a dry laugh, leaning back in his chair. "Is that so?" he said, his tone mocking. "Well, let me tell you something. This isn't a lesson in morality. If you're not here on official business, there's the door." The tension in the room was palpable now. A few customers exchanged uneasy glances. Near the corner, a young woman whispered to her friend, her voice trembling with excitement. "That's Clint Eastwood," she said, her words spreading like a ripple across the bank. Heads turned, whispers multiplied, and soon, everyone was staring. Everyone except Coleman. "I don't care who you are," Coleman continued, oblivious to the growing murmur around him. "If you don't have proof of your worth, you're wasting my time." Clint's faint smile faded, his posture straightened, and though he didn't raise his voice, the weight of his presence became undeniable. He took a step closer to Coleman's desk, his piercing gaze locked on the manager. "Worth," he repeated, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "That's an interesting word, Mr. Coleman." Before Coleman could respond, the bank's heavy doors swung open again. This time, a woman in her late 30s rushed in, her face flushed, her eyes glistening with emotion. She froze as her gaze landed on Clint. Her hand flew to her mouth, and tears welled up in her eyes. "Mr. Eastwood," she gasped, her voice trembling with disbelief. "It's you." The room fell silent. Clint turned to her, his expression softening. "Emily," he said gently, recognizing her instantly. "You're the reason my boys and I have a home," she continued, her voice breaking as tears spilled down her cheeks. "You paid off our mortgage last Christmas. I don't know what we would have done without you." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Customers who had been mere spectators now leaned forward, their expressions shifting from curiosity to awe. Coleman, on the other hand, looked as though the ground had been pulled out from under him. His face paled, his bravado crumbling as realization dawned. Clint stepped toward Emily, his demeanor warm and sincere. "It was the least I could do," he said quietly, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You and your boys deserve a fresh start." Emily nodded, unable to speak through her tears. The weight of her gratitude was tangible, filling the room with an almost sacred silence. Coleman, still frozen in place, finally stammered, I didn't realize. I mean, Mr. Eastwood. Clint turned back to him, his calm demeanor unchanged. It's not about who I am, Mr. Coleman, he said, his voice steady but firm. It's about how you treat people when you think no one's watching, or when you believe they can't do anything for you. Coleman opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and everyone in the room could feel it. The doors of the bank swung open again, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. A tall man in a perfectly tailored suit stepped inside, his polished shoes clicking on the marble floor. His confident stride and the quiet authority he exuded silenced even the faintest murmurs. It was David Montgomery, the CEO of Midtown Financial Bank, a man whose presence always commanded attention. His sharp gaze scanned the room until it landed on Clint Eastwood. Instantly, a smile spread across his face as he walked toward the legendary figure. Mr. Eastwood, Montgomery greeted warmly, extending his hand. What an unexpected honor. Clint rose from where he had been crouched moments before, shaking Montgomery's hand with a firm grip. His expression was polite, though his eyes held a guarded edge. It wasn't exactly planned, Clint replied, his voice calm, almost casual. Montgomery's sharp eyes darted toward Eric Coleman, whose complexion had gone pale. Sensing the tension, Montgomery addressed him directly. Mr. Coleman, I trust you've already been introduced to our principal investor, he said, his tone carrying a subtle weight. The man responsible for ensuring this institution survived the 2008 financial crisis. Coleman's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. His arrogance had melted away, replaced by a dawning realization that made his knees feel weak. I had no idea, he stammered, his voice barely audible. Clint raised a hand, cutting him off before he could say more. No need for apologies, Mr. Coleman, Clint said firmly, his tone carrying the weight of someone who had seen more than a lifetime's worth of arrogance and redemption. But let me give you something to remember. It's not about who I am. It's about how you treat the people who walk through these doors, especially the ones you think can't do anything for you. The room fell completely silent, Clint's words hanging in the air like a heavy, undeniable truth. Every person present felt the impact of his quiet wisdom. And for Coleman, it was a moment that would likely echo in his mind for years to come. Just as Clint turned to leave, a small voice called out from the cluster of onlookers. Mr. Eastwood? Clint paused, turning toward the sound. From the crowd emerged a young boy, no older than 7 or 8, clutching a crumpled piece of paper in his small hands. His mother stood a step behind him, her face flushed with embarrassment, but she didn't stop him from approaching. Clint's rugged face softened into a kind smile as he knelt down to the boy's level. Yes, buddy, he said, his voice as gentle as it was deep. The boy hesitated for a moment, glancing at his mother for reassurance before holding out the paper. It was a child's crayon drawing of a cowboy, complete with a wide-brimmed hat, boots, and a lasso. Are you really the cowboy from the movies? The boy asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his wide eyes full of wonder. Clint's chuckle was low and warm, a sound that carried across the quiet room and seemed to melt the tension still lingering in the air. I guess I am, he said, reaching into his pocket for a pen. With a steady hand, he signed the drawing, adding a little flourish to the name. Handing it back to the boy, Clint's smile grew as he added, but you know what's even better than being in the movies? The boy tilted his head, curiosity sparking in his eyes. What? He asked. Clint leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. Being kind, he said, because kindness lasts a lot longer than any movie ever will. The boy nodded slowly, as if trying to fully grasp the weight of Clint's words. His mother stepped forward then, her eyes glistening with tears. Thank you, she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. You've made his day. Clint straightened up, giving the mother a reassuring nod before glancing around the room one last time. The atmosphere had shifted dramatically. What had started as a place filled with tension and pretension now felt different, lighter, more human. The crowd of onlookers seemed humbled, their gazes following Clint as he walked toward the doors. Just before stepping outside, Clint turned back, locking eyes with Coleman for a brief moment. Remember this moment, he said, his voice calm but resolute. It's not for me. It's for the people you meet every day, the ones who need you to see them for who they really are. Coleman swallowed hard. Unable to muster a reply, Clint nodded once, then turned and walked out into the cool Los Angeles air. The sunlight hit his face as he paused on the sidewalk, his thoughts drifting to the countless people he'd encountered over the years. Some, like the boy and his mother, had touched his life in small but profound ways. Others, like Coleman, served as reminders of why kindness and humility mattered so much in a world often driven by ego and power. Clint's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen and saw the name Claire Harper. A faint smile crossed his face as he answered. Claire's voice, warm and familiar, came through the line. "Clint," she said, her tone light but tinged with concern. "How's it going? You doing okay?" Leaning against a nearby lamppost, Clint exhaled, the tension of the day slipping away. "Yeah, Claire," he said, his voice carrying a rare note of contentment. "I think I'm finally getting there." Claire chuckled softly. "Good. You've spent so much time looking out for everyone else. Maybe it's time you let someone do the same for you." Clint's smile grew faint, but his eyes reflected a newfound sense of peace. "Maybe you're right," he admitted, his tone uncharacteristically vulnerable. "I usually am," Claire teased, her voice brimming with affection. "Don't forget, you don't have to carry it all by yourself." The call ended, but her words stayed with him. As Clint walked down the bustling street, the crayon drawing of the cowboy came to mind. The boy's awe and innocence had reminded him of something he often overlooked. Life wasn't just about what you accomplished. It was about the connections you made, the lives you touched, and the moments of kindness that could change everything. For Clint Eastwood, the day at the bank wasn't about status or power. It was about reaffirming a belief he'd held onto for years, that even the smallest gestures of compassion could ripple outward, creating a better world for everyone. With each step he took, he carried not just the lessons of his past, but the quiet hope of what those lessons could inspire in others. The boy shook his head, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Being kind," Clint said simply, handing the paper back. As the boy grinned and ran back to his mother, Clint rose, his gaze sweeping over the room one last time. Without another word, he walked out into the Los Angeles sunlight, leaving behind a room full of people who would never forget what they had just witnessed. The color drained from Eric Coleman's face, and his body seemed to shrink under the weight of the realization crashing over him. Clint Eastwood, the man he had arrogantly dismissed moments ago, was no ordinary customer. He wasn't just a famous face from Hollywood either. He was the silent force behind the bank's survival, the majority shareholder who had saved the institution during the financial collapse of 2008. The room buzzed with whispers as this revelation swept through, leaving everyone staring at Coleman with barely concealed disbelief. Clint remained composed, though a shadow of disappointment flickered in his weathered features. Slowly, he turned to Emily, the woman who had tearfully shared her gratitude for his anonymous generosity. He bent slightly, offering her a warm, genuine embrace. As he pulled back, Clint whispered a few quiet words, meant only for her ears. Emily's face lit with a smile through her tears, and she nodded, placing a hand over her heart as if to steady the overwhelming emotions coursing through her. Then Clint turned his attention back to Coleman. The manager stood frozen in place, the air of confidence he had worn earlier now replaced by a palpable dread. Every eye in the room was fixed on Clint as he stepped forward, his deliberate movements carrying an unspoken authority. His voice, low and steady, filled the heavy silence. "It's not about who I am, Mr. Coleman," Clint began, his tone firm but calm. "It's about how you treat people when you think they can't do anything for you." Coleman's mouth opened, a faint stammer escaping, but no coherent words followed. His usual quick wit seemed to have evaporated in the face of Clint's quiet but commanding presence. Clint raised his hand, cutting off Coleman's attempted apology with a measured gesture. "This isn't about apologizing to me," Clint said, his voice like a quiet storm. "This is about understanding your responsibility. People walk through these doors with their hopes, their fears, and their dreams. It's your job to meet them with respect and decency, not to make them feel smaller than they already might. Coleman's shoulders sagged visibly under the weight of Clint's words. He lowered his gaze, no longer able to meet Clint's eyes. The atmosphere in the room was charged with a mix of unease and awe, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though the entire world had come to a standstill within the walls of the bank. The silence was broken by the sound of the glass doors swinging open. A man in a perfectly tailored suit entered the room, his polished shoes clicking against the tile with purpose. He walked with an air of confidence that turned heads immediately. David Montgomery, the CEO of Midtown Financial Bank, carried himself with a calm authority that rivaled even Clint's presence. His sharp eyes scanned the room, quickly taking in the tension in the air and the stunned expressions on every face. His gaze finally settled on Clint, and a warm, respectful smile spread across his face. "Mr. Eastwood," Montgomery greeted as he approached, extending a hand toward Clint. "What a pleasant surprise to see you here today." Clint shook his hand firmly, his own expression polite but guarded. "Wasn't exactly planned," Clint said simply, his words hinting at the unexpected turn of events that had unfolded. Montgomery's attention shifted briefly to Coleman, whose pale face betrayed the turmoil swirling within him. "Mr. Coleman," Montgomery said, his tone cool and edged with subtle reprimand. "I trust you've already made the acquaintance of our principal investor, the man responsible for ensuring this institution remained standing during one of its darkest hours." Coleman's knees seemed ready to buckle as the weight of his error fully dawned on him. He struggled to speak, his voice trembling with panic. I didn't know. I had no idea." Clint, however, raised his hand once more, silencing Coleman with a calm but decisive gesture. "It's not about what you knew," Clint said, his voice even and steady. "It's about what you've learned today. Let this moment stay with you, not because of who I am, but because of the next person who comes through these doors. They deserve better." The room remained hushed as Clint turned on his heel, walking toward the exit. The air felt lighter in his wake, though the weight of his message lingered heavily on everyone present. But before Clint could leave, a small, timid voice called out from the crowd. "Mr. Eastwood?" Clint paused mid-step, turning to find a young boy standing just a few feet away, holding a crumpled piece of paper. The boy's mother stood behind him, her face a mix of embarrassment and encouragement. Clint's rugged features softened as he crouched down to meet the boy at eye level. "Yes, buddy," he said, his tone warm and inviting. The boy hesitated for a moment, then held out the paper, a child's drawing of a cowboy. His voice was barely above a whisper as he asked, "Are you really the cowboy from the movies?" A deep chuckle rumbled from Clint's chest, low and comforting, as he took the paper. "I guess I am," he said, pulling a pen from his jacket pocket. Carefully, he signed his name on the drawing, adding a little flourish before handing it back. "But you know what's even better than being a cowboy in the movies?" The boy tilted his head, curiosity lighting up his wide eyes. "What?" Clint smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling with sincerity. "Being kind," he said, "because kindness lasts a whole lot longer than any movie ever will." The boy nodded solemnly, as though Clint had imparted a secret piece of wisdom just for him. His mother stepped forward, her eyes glistening with tears. "Thank you," she said softly. "You've made his day." Clint straightened up, giving her a nod of acknowledgement before turning once again toward the doors. As he stepped outside into the cool Los Angeles air, the sunlight bathed him in a soft glow. He took a deep breath, letting the tension of the day dissipate. His mind drifted to the people he had encountered, the grateful Emily, the humbled Coleman, and the wide-eyed boy with the cowboy drawing. Each one reminded him why he continued to pay forward the kindnesses he'd received in his own life. Clint's phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips as he saw the name, Claire Harper. The familiar name brought with it a sense of comfort, and as he answered the call, the warmth in his voice was unmistakable. "Hey, Claire," he said, leaning against a lamppost and watching the city bustle around him. "Yeah, I'm doing just fine." "Ah, Mr. Eastwood," Montgomery said, striding forward and extending his hand. "What an unexpected pleasure." Clint turned to greet him, shaking his hand with a firm grip. "I'd say the same," Clint replied, his voice carrying an edge of irony. Montgomery's gaze shifted to Coleman, who was now visibly sweating. "Mr. Coleman," Montgomery said sharply, "I trust you've had the privilege of meeting our principal investor, the man who single-handedly saved this institution when no one else would." Coleman's knees nearly gave way. He tried to stammer out another apology, but the lump in his throat seemed insurmountable. Clint, however, simply shook his head, his expression betraying no anger, only quiet disappointment. "There's no need for apologies," Clint said. "Just remember this moment. Not for me, but for the next person who walks through those doors." The room was still as a graveyard, the weight of Clint's words settling heavily on everyone present. Even the customers who had been mere bystanders felt the impact, their expressions shifting from curiosity to contemplation. As Clint turned to leave, a small voice broke through the silence. "Mr. Eastwood?" Clint paused mid-step and turned. A young boy, no older than 8, stepped forward from the line. In his hands was a crumpled piece of paper. His mother, visibly embarrassed, tried to tug him back, but the boy hesitated, his wide eyes locked on Clint. "Yes, buddy?" Clint asked, crouching down to the boy's level. His face, lined with years of life's lessons, softened into a kind smile. The boy held out the paper, a shaky crayon drawing of a cowboy. "Are you really the guy in the movies?" he asked shyly. A low chuckle rumbled in Clint's chest, his eyes lighting up for the first time that day. "I guess I am," he said, pulling a pen from his jacket pocket. Carefully, he signed the drawing, the action deliberate and heartfelt. He handed it back to the boy, but before he let go, he added, "You know what's better than being in movies?" The boy tilted his head, curiosity written all over his face. "What?" "Being kind," Clint said, his voice warm yet firm. The words hung in the air, simple yet profound. The boy grinned, clutching the drawing tightly as he ran back to his mother, who mouthed a silent "thank you" to Clint. The moment carried a ripple of warmth through the room, easing the tension that had lingered moments before. As Clint stood to his full height, Montgomery stepped closer, his tone respectful. "Mr. Eastwood," he began, "your presence here today, I hope it will serve as a reminder to all of us of the values this institution was built upon." Clint nodded slightly but said nothing more. His silence spoke volumes. With a final glance around the room, his gaze briefly settling on Coleman, he turned and walked toward the glass doors. But just as he stepped outside, the whispers and stares left behind him. Clint paused. He glanced upward at the sprawling city skyline, the warm sun casting long shadows across the pavement. He felt the weight of his own words echoing back to him. "It's not about who I am. It's about how you treat people." He adjusted his jacket and stepped onto the bustling sidewalk, blending into the crowd. Yet, as he walked away, his presence lingered in the bank, in the minds of everyone who had witnessed the encounter. For some, it was a lesson in humility. For others, it was a moment of inspiration. But for all, it was a reminder of the power of kindness, the kind that doesn't need recognition but leaves an indelible mark. And for Clint Eastwood, it was just another day of living by the values that had shaped his life: resilience, humility, and a belief that even the smallest gestures could make the world a better place. As the boy's grin widened, his mother stepped forward hesitantly, her eyes brimming with tears. Her voice trembled as she spoke, each word heavy with emotion. "You probably don't remember," she began, swallowing hard, "but years ago, you helped my husband when he lost his job. You didn't just give him money, you gave us hope when we needed it the most." Clint's faint smile softened further, and his gaze shifted, as though looking through the years to a memory tucked away but never forgotten. "I remember," he said gently, his gravelly voice carrying an undertone of warmth, "and I'm glad you're here today." The quiet exchange seemed to cast a spell over the room. Even Eric Coleman, who moments earlier had been drowning in arrogance, now stood in stunned silence, his expression one of a man grappling with his own shortcomings. The realization of what he had witnessed, the ripple effect of Clint's quiet generosity, hung heavy in the air, leaving everyone in the bank contemplating their own actions. Clint turned toward Emily, the bank teller whose gratitude had started the wave of revelations. His steady gaze met hers, and for a moment, it felt as though the room had faded away, leaving just the two of them. "Keep doing what you're doing," he said with sincerity. "People like you are the heart of this place." Emily nodded, her throat too tight with emotion to respond, but the understanding in her eyes said everything. With that, Clint stepped out of the bank, the cool Los Angeles breeze brushing against his face. The chaos of the city, honking horns, hurried footsteps, and muffled conversations surged back around him. But Clint didn't feel the weight of it. Instead, he felt something lighter, as though a burden he hadn't realized he was carrying had been eased. He walked a few steps down the sidewalk, his thoughts weaving between the present and the past. Images of the people he had quietly helped over the years flickered in his mind. He thought about the ones who had found their footing, the ones still struggling, and the countless others he had crossed paths with. And then, he thought of the promise he'd made to himself so long ago, a promise to repay the kindness that had once saved him when he had been at his lowest. His phone buzzed in his pocket, jolting him from his thoughts. Pulling it out, he glanced at the screen and saw a name that brought an instant flicker of warmth: Claire Harper. Claire had been a constant in his life, a steadfast friend who had known him before the fame and fortune, and who had stood by him through his most difficult times. He answered the call, his voice softening as he spoke. "Claire," he said, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at his lips. "Clint," she replied, her tone a mix of concern and familiarity. "Are you okay?" He paused, leaning against a nearby lamppost as the city's noise faded into the background. For a moment, he didn't answer, letting her words settle. Then, with a rare but genuine smile, he said, "Yeah, Claire, I think I'm finally getting there." Her voice carried a hint of amusement. "Good. You've been carrying the world on your shoulders for too long." Clint chuckled softly, the sound low and unhurried. "You've always known how to call me out," he admitted. "But maybe you're right. I always am," she quipped lightly, before her tone turned serious. "Clint, you do so much for others. Maybe it's time to let someone be there for you, too." He didn't respond immediately, her words settling like stones in still water. It was true, he had spent decades giving, pouring out kindness in quiet, unseen ways, but rarely had he let himself receive it. The thought lingered, its weight both comforting and unsettling. "I'll think about it," he said finally, his tone carrying a hint of both reluctance and resolve. "You better," Claire replied, her voice softening. "And don't forget, you're not alone." The call ended, leaving Clint standing in the afternoon light, the faint hum of the city wrapping around him like an old, familiar tune. He slid the phone back into his pocket, a quiet sense of clarity settling over him. Life wasn't just about the moments he gave to others, it was also about allowing himself the grace to be supported, to let people in. He began walking again, the streets alive with motion and color. Passing a cafe, he glanced at the reflection of his face in the window, lines etched by time and experience. Eyes that carried the weight of countless stories, yet still held a spark of something deeper. Not hope, exactly, but perhaps the quiet determination to keep moving forward. As he turned the corner, the memory of the boy's crayon drawing surfaced, bringing with it a faint smile. He thought of the boy's innocent question, "Are you really the guy in the movies?" And then his own response, "Being kind is better." It wasn't just a lesson for the boy, it was a reminder to himself. Kindness, no matter how small, carried the power to transform not just others, but the one offering it as well. Clint stopped briefly at a street vendor, buying a coffee from a young woman who looked to be working her second or third shift of the day. "Thank you," he said, handing her a tip that far exceeded the cost of the coffee. Her surprised but grateful smile was all the reward he needed. As he continued down the street, his mind returned to Claire's words, "Maybe it's time to let someone be there for you, too." The idea lingered, not as an immediate call to action, but as a seed planted in his heart. For Clint Eastwood, life had never been about the accolades or the legacy tied to his name. It was about the connections, the quiet, unseen moments where one act of kindness could ripple outward in ways no one could predict. And as he walked into the fading light of the day, He felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. The hope that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to carry it all alone anymore. Because sometimes, the most important stories weren't the ones written on the screen. They were the ones written in the hearts of the people whose lives he'd touched, one small act of kindness at a time.